William Blake is, of course, England's supreme poet of the city. Blake was born in London in the year 1757, before the Industrial Revolution, and died in 1827, having lived his whole life, apart from 3 years in a cottage at Felpham on the Sussex coast, in the city, to whose inhabitants he addressed his great prophetic books. The last of these, Jerusalem, bears the name of the holy city of the book of Revelation, the city coming down from heaven, which it is the human task to embody on earth. Blake's Jerusalem is the city of the imagination, the work of the golden builders who labor to create on earth a city in the likeness of the invisible world within, for the kingdom of heaven is within. The outer world, unilluminated by the imaginative vision, Blake calls Babylon, biblical symbol of the city of exile, where the Jews lived far from the Holy Land. Jerusalem is the kingdom of the human imagination, which Blake, following his master Swedenborg, calls the divine humanity, who is in all. The city is our human kingdom, our human collective task, never completed, ever building, ever decaying, desolate, in Blake's words. It is for every generation to keep that city in repair, to add to it new works for the soul to inhabit, as we inhabit the entire human past. These works embody our deepest knowledge and sublimest visions, and in turn serve to awaken their inhabitants to know ourselves as participants in that invisible kingdom we ever seek to embody. For Blake, then, the city is above all its people, has a collective life of the many in one and one in many, who inhabit and create it over the generations, and its own especial character. He wrote of the cities of England, Verulam, Canterbury, venerable parent of men, generous immortal guardian golden clad. For cities are men, fathers of multitudes, and rivers and mountains are also men. Everything is human, mighty, sublime. The giant Albion, that is the English nation, reposes among his 28 cities, and Blake names Edinburgh, clothed with fortitude, York, Selsey, Chichester, Oxford with its healing leaves, Bath, Durham, Lincoln, Carlisle, Ely, Norwich, Peterborough, each with its own character. But Jerusalem is not to be found at any one time or place, but is universal, created wherever humankind is at work. And there are cities not yet embodied in time and space's womb to spring up for Jerusalem. He names America, where there will be planted the seeds of cities and villages in the human bosom. It was in this sense that Blake's desire was to see England become a holy land, embodying the heavenly archetype. The human story begins in the garden, nature, and ends in the creation of the human kingdom, the city. The city is not only its buildings, it is a great energy of creation at work. It comprises not architecture alone, but painting, music and poetry, schools and universities, works of science, all expressions in things great and small, which embody our inner and create our outer worlds. In antiquity, cities, Albion, Athens, Jerusalem, Florence, Spencer's London, queen of cities all, were loved and valued by their inhabitants, and banishment was deemed the worst of punishments. Inner city areas had not become a name designating human problems of neglect and desolation. What disaster has befallen us that our cities have become places of alienation and exile? Blake's poem, London, describes not buildings but people, and already he saw London suffering from a deadly sickness. His words, written at the end of the 18th century, are no less true today. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and see in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. The poem continues with an indictment of war, child labour, the indifference of both church and state to human suffering, and the self-righteous respectability blasted by the youthful harlot's curse. The streets and the river itself are chartered. They are property. Blake was bitter in his protest against those commercial values which already dominated the public domain. Commerce is so far from being beneficial to the arts or to empires that it is destructive to both, as all their history shows. Empires flourish until they become commercial, and then they are scattered abroad to the four winds. It is the arts, works of the imagination, that build great civilizations. Let it no more be said that empires encourage arts, for it is the arts that encourage empires. Arts and artists are spiritual and laugh at mortal contingencies. It is not arts that follow and attend upon empire, but empire that attends and follows the arts. Blake lamented the absence of such enlightened patronage as the papacy and the Medici, who set the artists to build and adorn the cities of Italy. He would, for he was a patriot of the imagination, have liked to make England what Italy is, an envied storehouse of intellectual riches. Instead, the dark satanic mills of the industrial landscape were already coming into being as the outer reflection of a materialist ideology which was to prevail during the next century and beyond. A century after Blake, that other poet of London, T.S. Eliot, saw the city as a wasteland and described its people as in a Dantesque hell. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final line. Eliot's is not a hell of material poverty, but of spiritual alienation. He saw in its outcome what Blake had seen in its causes. Blake's London is what Henri Corbin, the great French Ismaili scholar, has called an emblematic city. By this he means that the outer forms, buildings, districts, and regions are correspondences of inner realities, experiences, visions. It was Corbin who coined the word imaginal, as distinct from the imaginary, to designate realities of the world of the imagination, which, far from being imaginary in the popular sense of the word, unreal, non-existent, are realities of mind. The outer forms mediate, open to us in symbolic language, be these paintings, sculptures, music, or architecture, regions of our inner worlds. An emblematic city, in Corbin's understanding, is a great mediating symbol, at once an embodiment of an imaginative vision, and empowered to awaken that vision, that perception of invisible values and meanings in the minds of its inhabitants. In a paper on emblematic cities, which we published, in fact, in Temenos, written to accompany a collection of photographs of Isfahan by the French photographer Henri Sterlin, Corbin writes of Athens as understood by Plato in the Parmenides. It is the Panathenaea, festival of the triumph of the goddess of wisdom over the giants, symbolizing chaos and ignorance, that, I quote, brings the philosophers together in a place which no longer belongs to the topography of the world. Athens is an emblematic city. So in the Middle Ages was the city of Compostela, famous place of pilgrimage. Nicholas Flamel, the alchemist, received enlightenment after a pilgrimage to Compostela, of which Corbin writes. The alchemist's work consists in making apparent what is hidden, a bringing to light which occurs in the first place within the alchemist himself. Such is the preparation demanded for the transmutation of common mercury into philosophical mercury. And it is at Compostela that the transformation takes place, but a city of Compostela which is no longer situated in the land of Spain, but in that hidden land which is the innermost being of the alchemist philosopher. Compostela is an emblematic city. Corbin then goes on to Blake's London as a city where we discover the spirit, the hidden significance of which a body or a building is only one typification. And again I quote, "And this is why in the poems of William Blake, amid the jumble of unknown worlds, the turmoil of skies and heavenly beings with strange names, the reader suddenly comes upon places whose names are familiar, unexpectedly inserted into the mystic worlds. For beneath the appearances of day-to-day London, William Blake discerns a London more real than the London visible to bodily eyes, for which it is accountable. In the buildings, mosques and dwellings and palaces of Isfahan, Corbin sees one of the architectural wonders of the world. He sees as our task the deciphering of the message left us by the builders of Isfahan, a rendezvous at which the mere historical tourist will never arrive, since that message is metaphysical. Blake's London is not like Isfahan or like our own Gothic cathedrals, a message of wisdom left for us to decipher, but rather a work in progress. I behold London, a human, awful wonder of God. He says, return, Albion, return. I give myself for thee. My streets are my ideas of imagination. My houses are thoughts. My inhabitants, affections. The children of my thoughts, walking within my blood vessels. So spoke London, immortal guardian. And Blake leaves us in no doubt that his visions are embodied in times and places, for the message ends, I heard in Lambeth's shade, in Felpham I saw and heard visions of Albion, I write in South Moulton Street what I both see and hear in regions of humanity, in London's opening streets. The heavenly Jerusalem can never in the nature of time and change be fully realized, yet she has her secret chambers in the houses of London's inhabitants, her golden builders, and among those Blake's own home in Lambeth, where he and his young wife Catherine lived in the early years of their married life, and where a vine grew unpruned in their small garden. There, Blake's earliest prophetic books were written. We builded Jerusalem as a city and a temple. From Lambeth we began our foundations. Lovely Lambeth, lovely hills of Camberwell. Perhaps no longer. As Blake listened to the voices of London, he heard much that was terrible. Young men conscripted as cannon fodder for the Napoleonic Wars, the chimney sweeper's cry, the industrial enslavement of women and children, all the sufferings and injustices of a society from which Jerusalem, the soul, is banished, cast forth upon the wilds of poplar and bow, to Malden and Canterbury in the delights of cruelty, the shuttles of death sing in the sky, to Islington and Pancras, round Marylebone to Tyburn's river. Tyburn's deathful shades, where boys were hanged for minor offences against property. In the streets of London, not Jerusalem but Babylon reigned supreme. I behold Babylon in the opening streets of London. I behold Jerusalem in ruins, wandering about from house to house. This I behold, the shuttles of death attend my steps. Would he have found it otherwise now? But Blake was no utopian idealist nor political campaigner. The foundations of the city are not within the domain of politicians and institutions, but within ourselves, and it is there that the labours of building Jerusalem must begin. What are those golden builders doing? Where was the burying place of Sophtithinthus? Near Tyburn's fatal tree? Is that mild Zion's hill's most ancient promontory? Near mournful, ever-weeping Paddington? Is that Calvary and Golgotha becoming a building of pity and compassion? Lo, the stones are pity, and the bricks well-wrought affections, enamelled with love and kindness, and the tiles engraven gold, labour of merciful hands. The beams and rafters of forgiveness, the mortar and cement of the work, tears of honesty. The nails and screws and iron braces are well-wrought blandishments and well-contrived words, firm fixing, never forgotten, always comforting the remembrance. The floors, humility. The ceilings, devotion. The hearth, thanksgiving. Prepare the furniture, O Lambeth, in thy pitying looms, the curtains, woven tears and sighs, wrought into lovely forms for comfort. There the secret furniture of Jerusalem's chamber is wrought. Lambeth, the bride, the Lamb's wife, loveth thee. Thou art one with her, and knowest not of self in thy supreme joy. Go on, builders in hope, though Jerusalem wanders far away, without the gate of loss, among the dark Satanic mills. Blake's city of the imagination, the city within, of which the material city is an image and expression, he called Golgonooza, from Golgos, the skull, for it is to be found in the human brain, in the mind. Its reality is mental and living, human, not a dead world of matter, but a living world of imagined forms. Excuse me. And Blake echoes Shakespeare's line in A Midsummer Night's Dream on the nature of imagination. Remember, the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. We acted A Midsummer Night's Dream in school when we were in the fifth form. Perhaps some of you also know these lines, which are marvellous, of course, on the nature of imagination. And Blake writes of the builders of Golgonooza, some sons of loss. Loss is the spirit of vision. He is the visionary one of the four Zoas. surround the passions with porches of iron and silver, creating forms of beauty around the dark regions of sorrow, giving to airy nothing a name and a habitation delightful, with bounds to the infinite, putting off the indefinite into most holy forms of thought. Such is the power of inspiration. They labour incessant with many tears and afflictions, creating a beautiful house for the piteous sufferer. Golgonooza is built continually amid the furnaces and anvils of the creative genius, realizing in London Corbin's emblematic city. Here, on the banks of Thames, Los builded Golgonooza. In fears he builded it, in rage and fury. It is the spiritual fourfold London, continually building and continually decaying desolate. In eternal labours, loud the furnaces and loud the anvils. Blake's city of Golgonooza is fourfold. Fourfold because man is fourfold. A truth that since Blake addressed his prophetic words to his uncomprehending contemporaries, C.G. Jung has made familiar to us as a psychological fact. Man's nature is fourfold, inhabiting the four distinct regions of the senses, of feeling, of reason, and of vision. Blake's four living creatures, the four Zers, whose characters and worlds, conflicts and ultimate reconciliation within the divine humanity, form the dramatic themes of the prophetic books, correspond in all respects to Jung's perception of the archetypal structure of the psyche with its four functions. In the city of the imagination, each of these must find expression and play its part and receive its sustenance within the city, reason and feeling, the living senses and the imaginative vision. Blake insists on this fourfold structure of Golgonooza, and every inhabitant is fourfold, and every pot and vessel and garment and utensils of the houses and every garment fourfold. Blake devotes many pages to descriptions of the city of Golgonooza, its diagrammatic fourfold archetypal structure in the form of a mandala, a mental diagram Jung found to be inherent in the structure of the psyche and compared to the similar spiritual diagrams familiar in Tibetan and Indian symbolic art. Imagination builds the universe within the sacred enclosure, the temenos, of the city of Golgonooza. Outside that city is the lifeless mechanistic world of what Blake describes as single vision and Newton's sleep, and the dark satanic wheels of a universe lacking the vertical dimension of humankind's inner and higher invisible worlds. A lifeless world in which only the quantifiable is deemed real. For Blake, all the four regions of the imagination are living worlds. The material world itself is alive, and every particle of dust breathes forth its joy. Blake saw the scientific materialism, which has to become the dominant ideology of the 19th century, as a hell cut off from life. Plato wrote of humankind unilluminated by a vision of the real as prisoners living in a cave where they could see only shadows cast on the wall of the cave which they took to be reality. Blake takes up Plato's theme in describing the hells which lie outside the city of imagination. Around Golgonooza lies the land of death eternal, a land of pain and misery and despair and ever-brooding melancholy. There is the cave, the rock, the tree, the lake of Udan Adan, the forest and the marsh, and the pits of bitumen deadly, the rocks of solid fire, the valleys, the plains of burning sand, the rivers, cataracts and lakes of fire, the islands of the fiery lakes, the trees of malice, revenge, and black anxiety. These are the hells of those cut off from the divine vision which inspires continually the labourers of Golgonooza. Repeatedly Blake returns to the theme of Albion's loss of the divine vision. Refusing to behold the divine image which all behold and live thereby, he is sunk down into a deadly sleep. The divine image, the divine humanity, that, as Blake calls Jesus, the imagination, that is the human archetype written in every human soul, the true self. The divine image is Blake's Jesus, the imagination. This presence is in all. It is the true humanity, which in Blake's telling of the story of the fall, we fall short of through forgetfulness. Sleep is Blake's term, borrowed from Plotinus, who likewise sees that loss as sleep, or as we would say in modern terms, a fall into unconsciousness. The poet, whose type for Blake is Milton, is called the awakener, because poetry, and indeed all the arts, serve to remind and awaken the oblivious sleeper of the higher world, the divine archetype. Whereas in Eastern civilizations, meditation and yoga of various modes are ways to reach fuller consciousness, for Blake it is the arts that serve to remind and awaken. Poetry, painting, and music, the three powers in man of conversing with paradise, which the flood did not sleep away. The flood of time and space, as he elsewhere calls it. And elsewhere he also includes, I'm glad to say, architecture in the arts which enable man to converse with paradise. The city of Golgonooza, therefore, exists in time and is the labour of men and women to realize the holy city on earth as it is in heaven, to build the outer city in the image of the inner city, or in the words of the Irish mystic A.E., to make the politics of time conform to the politics of eternity. Such was Plato's theme, such was Augustine's, and as with all sacred cities of whatever religious traditions. Corbin speaks of Isfahan as a city whose message is left for us to decipher. He implies, as indeed he well knew, that Isfahan and other of the wonderful buildings of Islamic culture were communications of knowledge, a total knowledge of our humanity, built with understanding of mathematical principles, buildings that satisfy mind and senses alike, whose adornments of ceramics, decorated with flowers and flowing calligraphy, satisfy the heart's desire for beauty, and whose subtle use of images reflected in water, light refracted from gleaming surfaces, awaken understanding of spiritual realities, as do our Gothic cathedrals, embodying as they do the whole Christian doctrine in sculptured depictions of Christ and his disciples, which communicate human nobility and dignity and the gentleness of the Virgin Mary and her child. And not in sculpture alone, but in the inner spaces created by the architects, who define inner regions and higher regions, where our thoughts can rest in sanctuary or ascend into mystery of rising arches. The art of stained glass transforms the light of common day into the light of vision. The geometric forms of rose window communicate knowledge at once of the visible and the invisible cosmos. Values and meanings of soul and spirit are given unaging forms and language in terms of a coherent and total spiritual cosmology. So with the temples of India, the stupas of the Far East. It is remarkable how the stupa recently built by the river in Battersea Park has wordlessly imposed a kind of reverential behaviour on strollers in the park. Little offerings of flowers are always to be seen, and surely not all left there by Asiatics in exile. It speaks its message of peace, and its builders, Japanese Buddhist monks, intended. What is communicated by our commercial cities, our high-rise buildings, our airports and motorways? Power and knowledge of a kind, certainly. Material power and material knowledge, but not the fourfold knowledge which embodies the four regions of our humanity in the unity of wholeness. Not for nothing is New York City known as Babylon. It's wonderful, of course, the sun setting at the end of those great avenues with their streaming cars with red and green and yellow lights, or the lit-up towers at night reflected in the East River. But those tall buildings are also trivial, meaningless, some ridiculous fancy placed on their pinnacles. Our cities may proclaim a triumph of material knowledge, but to the soul they tell nothing. Even, perhaps, they proclaim not the divine humanity, but that we are negligible and unloved, or tell of some abstract universe not belonging to us at all. Or is New York City also a human, awful wonder of God? But what message does it convey to its inhabitants? Modern man in search of a soul. It is not for me to say. I love it, of course. It is one of the wonders of the world. But I grew up in the heyday of the modern movement, whose architects and town planners were nothing if not idealistic. In their utopian idealism, they set out to improve social conditions, to provide housing for the workers with every amenity and convenience technology could provide. No one can deny that they are responsible for many excellent things. Le Corbusier, the architectural genius of that movement, in the belief that he knew what humankind needed, built his famous workers' flats in Marseille and even had a plan to replace the beloved Paris we know with a new and better city designed by himself. Yet, I remember Herbert Reed, himself the spokesman in this country for the modern movement, saying that it was a strange fact that although everyone admired Corbusier's buildings, people didn't want to live in them. What was missing, of course, in the modern movement, essentially an atheist materialist ideology with leanings towards Marxism, was those invisible dimensions the soul inhabits. The works of that movement, though some reflect the cosmic proportions, are not fourfold. These architects and planners were aware of material needs, but not those of the soul, for few believed in the soul as a universe distinct from the natural body, or in spirit as the ground of reality at all levels. In those well-planned housing estates, Jerusalem, the soul, remains in exile. Maxwell Fry himself said that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity. But a materialist ideology, lacking the divine image that all behold and live thereby, can create only an image of an image. The living inner source of beauty remains hidden. When I was a student at Cambridge, and we were all, like every generation, eager to scan the scene of the brave new world before us, we were supposed to admire Battersea Power Station as a monumental expression of the socialist work ideal. Well designed as Giles Gilbert Scott's building may be to serve its function, and functional was the fashionable word of the day, it is not a fourfold building. Heart and soul remain excluded. I can't read that word. They are not on those four chimneys proclaiming the might of collective man, we do not find heart and soul satisfied by that statement. And now it is not even functional. Nobody knows what to do with it. Charmed as we may be by a modern railway station or some spectacular airport, unless the meanings and values our cities embody are adequate to our humanity in its full dignity, the city will remain a place of exile to the souls of its inhabitants. Communism in those days seemed the epitome of social justice and would create a better world of equality, peace and cooperation, whereas religion, the opium of the people, would soon be a thing of the past. I have lived to see that the outcome was far otherwise. For it is said that man shall not live by bread alone, and the utopian empire collapsed from within. What will happen to our Western materialist empires remains to be seen, or perhaps we can already see. Blake's phrase, the dark satanic mills, seems to describe perfectly a whole epoch of industrial cities. But it is well to remember that Blake did not use that phrase to describe an industrial landscape, but to describe the Newtonian universe, conceived as a mechanism of natural cause and effect, an ideology which was, to Blake's prophetic understanding, a false ideology in its denial of the immeasurable worlds of soul and spirit, and indeed of nature itself as a living world and not a mechanism. That mechanistic ideology found its expression indeed in those industrial cities built in the likeness of that ideology, and the phrase "those dark satanic mills" has become current as a recognizable description of a landscape built in the likeness of an ideology. Do we not always live in the cities we deserve? Yes, you may say, but surely we must consider material needs first. Certainly the architects of the modern movement and utopian socialism cannot be faulted in this respect. But can these needs in all the regions of the fourfold human universe be separated? Who does not know those anonymous building estates where the eye looks in vain for something of beauty on which to rest? We wander the streets, an image Blake often uses in writing of Jerusalem's lot in the streets of Babylon, but soul never finds its home. After a country childhood, I spent my school years in Ilford, a dormitory suburb where the standard of living was more than adequate, but always with the sense of inconsolable exile. I remember nothing beautiful there, except for trees and little flower gardens in front of the houses, and a grotto and a wishing well in Valentine's Park. Can material and spiritual needs be separated? Blake wrote with passion against social injustices and cruelties, but above all, he indicted the Industrial Revolution because it was soul-destroying, because Albion's machines are woven with his life. And all the arts of life, they changed into the arts of death in Albion. The hourglass, contemned because its simple workmanship was like the workmanship of the ploughman, and the water wheel that raises water into cisterns, broken and burned with fire because its workmanship was like the workmanship of the shepherd, and in their stead intricate wheels invented, wheel without wheel, to perplex youth in their outgoings, and to bind to labours in Albion of day and night the myriads of eternity, that they may grind and polish brass and iron, hour after hour, laborious task, kept ignorant of its use, that they might spend the days of wisdom in sorrowful drudgery, to obtain a scanty pittance of bread, in ignorance to view a small portion, and think it all, and call it demonstration, blind to all the simple rules of life. But is not beauty something only the rich and privileged can afford? Here there is an all-important difference between material wealth and the treasures of the imagination, a difference not in degree but in kind. In the material world, goods and resources are limited, so that if one receives more, another receives less. If a sum of money or a piece of land is shared among 100 people, each will receive 100th part. Equal sharing is no answer, for in material terms this can only mean less and less for more and more participants in a diminishing world of ever smaller parcels. No doubt this is an oversimplification, and some will object that creating wealth is precisely the object of an industrial society. More and more cars and washing machines for more and more people. Technology is forever running to keep up with the demand it creates. But in the city of the imagination, it is otherwise. Blake's spiritual fourfold London eternal, with its mighty spires and domes of ivory and gold, belongs to all. How can this be? The riches of the imagination are not diminished by the number of participants, but multiplied. Whereas, if 100 share a sum of money, each receives 100th part. If 100 listen to a concert of music by Schubert or Bach, each receives the whole without diminishment. Like the light of the sun, the cathedrals of Chartres and Durham and Westminster Abbey, Botticelli's Primavera, Hamlet and Lear and Odysseus and Figaro inhabit the minds of multitudes without the least diminution. Nor is there envy and rivalry in a world where a shared love of some poet or painter or a childhood within the precincts of some abbey or cathedral forms a bond of mutual delight. The inhabitants of the Sancta Civitas are without number, and its treasuries inexhaustible. And that, surely, is civilization, linking past and future and every race on earth. And do not the poor as well as the rich need beauty, and have not other ages provided it? Blake supremely admired the builders of the great cities of art, Michelangelo and the other Florentine architects, who were, like the builders of our own Gothic cathedrals, working according to the true forms of the imagination, recognized and loved by all, because innate in all. The typical city of the materialist civilization may meet a certain standard of living, or even of the American way of life, with its superabundance of material goods. But what is notably lacking in cities built without the vision of the heavenly original is any trace of beauty, where the soul can find peace and delight. There may be stupendous works in terms of size, productivity, efficiency, but the soul is starved. In the absence of beauty, the soul is always an exile. But in the Sancta Civitas there are no exiles, for no matter whether it be at Rome, Athens, or some little timber-built town in New England, we feel instantly happy and at ease there. The expression examples almost without thinking: temples, churches, mosques, the tombs of Christian or Islamic saints, temples of ancient Egypt or Mexico. For there is, at the heart of all beauty, and of the archetype inscribed within us, by whose means we measure the beautiful, a sacred essence. Those works which most fully satisfy our thirst for beauty are always surely reflect some vision of the sacred, some spiritual aspiration. They cannot, so it seems, be created unless this be so. In the sanctuaries of all cultures we feel at home. We feel a sense of familiarity, whereas in the secular cities of the modern West we may be impressed, but we feel inconsolably alien, nor will long familiarity make such cities home to our hearts. One has but to sit for an hour in the Piazza Navona to understand that the need for beauty is alike in rich and poor, young, old. All love that generous yet sheltering space, those abundant fountains, those sculptures expressing human energy and delight. The neighbouring churches and monuments, down to the stalls where simple crafts are displayed, little pottery figures of the shepherds and the angels, toys, sweets, all kinds of useless, ephemeral things to delight us. The whole world feels at home there, because Rome was built to delight mind and heart, as well as to house the body. And there's plenty to buy to eat in the Piazza Navone also, coffee, all sorts of things. The senses too satisfied. And is it not Italy's immemorial secret that rich and poor were never segregated, but share their cities to this day? A bronze boy and a tortoise on the brim of a fountain, a virgin and child on the wall, where all come and go, never without her tribute of little coloured lights. Even in an age that can no longer attain the vision that raised cathedrals on whose sculptures we may read the entire story of man's creation and redemption, as on the portals of Chartres and Wells, we find glimpses and gleams of the mundus imaginalis. In Piccadilly Circus, statue of Eros, and Peter Pan, archetype of the poor Eternus, or Rima, spirit of the wild. Do we not all need the bronze lions in Trafalgar Square, such as they are, and those deer that invite us into an imagined forest in Hyde Park, the fountains and dolphins and tortoises, no less than we need washing machines? Poetry is the house of the soul, I.A. Richards somewhere said, and W.B. Yeats, Blake's first editor and greatest disciple, understood our need to inhabit the world of the imagination always. He wrote of that inheritance, of stories and of personages and of emotions passed on from generation to generation. I wished for a world where I could discover this tradition perpetually, he writes, and not in pictures and poems only, but in the tiles round the chimney-piece and in the hangings that kept out the draught. We do not need Buslinan to distract us from distraction by distraction, if the world we daily inhabit speaks to us continually of that invisible inner world. Even T.S. Eliot knew how occasional glimpses and gleams of beauty from that other world will sometimes smile in London's wasteland. This music crept by me upon the waters, and along the Strand up Queen Victoria Street. Oh, city, city, I can sometimes hear, beside a public bar in Lower Thames Street, the pleasant whining of a mandolin and a clatter and a chatter from within, where fishmen lounge at noon, where the walls of Magnus Martyr hold inexplicable splendour of Ionian white and gold. Is it not vital that a vision of the world of imagination all share be reflected in every time and place if we are to survive as civilized beings? That our cities be emblematic cities of the human archetypal universe in its wholeness. Thank you. I am going to talk about two poems which you probably know very well, Sailing to Byzantium, which was written in 1917, and Byzantium, written in 1930. And Byzantium was a symbol which Yeats chose, as you will see, for a central symbol of what he conceived civilization to be. Well, my paper is entitled Yeats's Holy City of Byzantium. Yeats's holy city, not the city of Byzantium as such, of course. What is the city? The city is not to be found in nature. It is a uniquely human creation. Indeed, it is the uniquely human creation. For the city is the dwelling place humanity has created for itself. But that habitation is not the buildings alone, not mere housing, as in all too many modern building estates. The buildings of a true city are habitations of the mind and soul, as well as of the body. Architecture is more than building. It is an idea which informs the structure of bricks or stone. I.A. Richards, who loved Plato, called poetry the house of the soul. And a city is built not for the body alone, but for the soul. The city is the embodiment of the human kingdom of the imagination in all its four regions of the bodily senses, reason, feeling, and vision. And only when this fourfold nature of humanity is expressed and embodied can we feel ourselves to be its citizens in the full sense. The real city, one may say, is the invisible city, the archetype. A.K. Kumaraswamy, in an essay entitled What is Civilization?, describes Plato's idea of a cosmic city of the world, whose structure is the same as that of every individual soul. The same four functions or energies or castes, Plato writes, are to be found in the city and in each of its inhabitants. The law which governs the city is the same law which governs human nature. The principle of justice, therefore, is the same throughout, and that is that each member of the community should perform the task for which he is best fitted by nature. This, of course, is the original intent of India's long-enduring caste system, and more recently, C.G. Jung has redefined the four psychological types which he equates with the four living creatures of St. John's Apocalypse and many other examples of the same mandala structure from antiquity and from every part of the world. This archetypal city is a holy city, for as the heart is the living center of the body, so the heart of the city is a sacred temenos, church or temple or mosque, around which expands as from a center all the rich differentiation of a city's life in an orderly manner, the fourfold structure differentiating into a duodecimal zodiac of the tribes of men. And as the one sun lights the whole world, so the one divine self illuminates the invisible city within. The type of all cities of God is, within Christendom, St. John's New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. The city, that is given by revelation, by inspiration to the soul, for the kingdom of heaven is within. St. John's city is a perfect cube, and also a duodecimal city with 3 gates on each of its 4 walls. Comparable mandala structures can be found all over the world, and it seems that this plan of the city is innate in the human imagination everywhere. The city of Jerusalem itself and its temple conform to this pattern in many essential respects, and the city of Byzantium was deliberately built as a holy city in conformity with the Christian archetype. It is arguable that our modern secular cities are not true cities, since they do not conform to the innate pattern at whose heart is the temenos, or sacred enclosure, from which the life of the city naturally grows. Lawmaking and administration, all the skills and crafts, the learning and the arts, producing whatever of use and beauty humankind needs and enjoys. In the absence of this pattern, we feel ourselves in exile, and yet Anywhere in the world, this natural structure will begin to form and differentiate itself in a division of labour according to knowledge and skills whose endless refinements have perhaps never so marvellously flourished as in Byzantium. So at least Yeats believed. The city of Constantinople was established on the older site of the Greek Byzantium by the Emperor Constantine in the year 352 and continued for more than 1,000 years until its conquest under Constantine II by Mohammed II in 1453. Constantine was the first emperor to declare Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and he built Byzantium as the first Christian city. Yeats's master, William Blake, had already made the Holy City his theme in works that Yeats knew well, for he was the first editor of Blake's prophetic books. Blake's great mythological poem Jerusalem bears the name of the archetypal city itself. This eternal city was to be embodied in Blake's own city of London. Here on the banks of Thames we builded Jerusalem, Blake wrote, and was the work of those golden builders to be found in all cities in every time and place. Blake's poem is a great moral indictment of all that is contrary to the Holy Spirit in man, called by Blake by the Swedenborgian term, the divine humanity, and Jesus, the imagination. Blake describes in great elaboration the fourfold structure of the city of Golgonooza, the spiritual fourfold, London eternal, ever building, ever decaying, desolate. Its builders are all those who practice the virtues of pity and compassion, love and kindness and mercy and devotion and thanksgiving. In many pages he indicts the cruelty of the natural religion which denies the invisible kingdom and its master. Blake also describes the part played by the arts in building beautiful forms that the generating souls can inhabit, the houses and gardens and fields of the imagination. Yeats would not have differed from Blake in these things, but was himself a poet, for whom wisdom and beauty, rather than Plato's justice and law, or Blake's mercy, pity, peace and love, were paramount. In the two poems in which he writes of his holy city of Byzantium, we are in a world very different from Blake's Jerusalem. And yet, Yeats too pays homage to the same invisible master, for he chose Byzantium, a Christian city, as his symbol, although for the God within, Yeats does not use the name of Jesus, but rather the Platonic term, intellect. Yeats's holy city of Byzantium was not the city built by Constantine, which of course Yeats had never seen, though he had seen in Italy the Ravenna mosaics of the reign of Justinian. His two poems, Sailing to Byzantium, 1927, and Byzantium, 1930, take Byzantium as a symbol which enables the poet to make his own statement and his own contribution to that universal city of which Plato spoke. Sailing to Byzantium begins, you will remember, by saying what the city is not. It is not a part of nature, but that city of the imagination coming down from God out of heaven, discerned by the soul. Yeats's Byzantium is a vision of and a creation of the divine beauty. No poet has been more responsive to mortal beauty than was Yeats, and I remember the cold shock with which, in my 20s, I found the poet of the Lake Isle of Innisfree renouncing the beautiful natural world for monuments of unaging intellect, which at that time seemed to me abstract and life-denying. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. But Yeats was no life-denying otherworldly ascetic, and in renouncing those dying generations at their song, he praises them. For what, then, is that renunciation made that the poet should see it as an order higher than nature? According to a Platonic fable in the Laws, echoed by Plotinus, in youth the soul is feeble and the body full of life, while, as the body ages, the soul grows younger towards its perfection. And this is the theme of the second stanza. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. To the secular West, for whom the bodily life is all, and death the end, where women cling to their fading beauty, and men to their declining powers, an aged man is indeed a paltry thing, no better than a scarecrow, a tattered coat upon a stick. Therefore, Yeats crosses those mackerel-crowded seas to reach the holy city of Byzantium, city of the arts, there to study the soul's creation, monuments of its own magnificence. With that powerful word, he declares his own allegiance to another order than that of nature, the universe of soul, of which all art is an embodiment. In the absence of any real conviction that such an order exists at all, the centuries of Western materialism have clung to description of nature as the theme of art, unlike spiritual civilizations of the past, for whom the invisible order of the soul's life has been the theme of poets and painters. Therefore, Yeats takes as his singing school that order of art which tells not of nature but of the soul's world. Blake too had declared that there is no natural religion, and reproached Wordsworth, great poet as he was, saying Wordsworth must know that what he writes valuable is not to be found in nature, and he quotes Michelangelo's sonnet. Heaven-born, the soul a heavenward course must hold beyond the visible world. Her own magnificence lies within, and that magnificence is the image of the heavenly city. In a vision, Yeats sets forth his great unifying symbol of the phases of the moon. In the section on the movement of the great year of history through those phases, he had already written his reasons for choosing Byzantium as symbol of the supreme moment of fulfillment in phase 15, when the moon is at the full and the world of the soul comes to perfection. This is a phase of complete beauty, he wrote. Now contemplation and desire, united into one, inhabit a world where every beloved image has bodily form, and every bodily form is loved. For more than 1,000 years, Byzantium was the wonder of the world. Geographically and culturally situated between the Mediterranean world of Europe and Egypt, it was open to the culture of Greece and Persia, and in due course the empire of the caliphs, trading with Russia, India, and China. As Byzantium waxed, imperial Rome waned. Unrivaled in power and wealth, Byzantium contained in her days of glory some 1,000,000 citizens. Standing between the Eastern and the Western worlds, she imported rich silks from China, spices from India, her learning from Greece, her culture from Persia. Treasuries of art from the 4 quarters of the known world poured into her treasuries, while her churches, palaces, theatres, libraries, baths and stadium were the creation of her builders and craftsmen. The earlier church of Hagia Sophia was destroyed by fire in the reign of Justinian and Theodora, 6th century, who thereafter rebuilt in less than 6 years the great church of the Holy Wisdom, which Justinian proudly claimed surpassed the legendary Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Now a mosque, the rich mosaics of holy personages have gone, but the lustre of marbles of various colours, jasper and porphyry, and precious gems and metals which dazzled the eyes of barbarians from the distant lands of the Roman Empire remain. Above all, the great dome, an architectural marvel, would then have been inlaid with those mosaic figures who seem to stand in an optical space outside, not behind, the surface on which they gleam. Yeats had himself seen the mosaics of Ravenna, likewise the work of Justinian and Theodora. The goddess of wisdom, in her Greek form, had long been worshipped as Pallas Athene when Athens was the great city, and it was not to any of the Christian saints, but to the Holy Wisdom that Byzantium's great church was dedicated, and it is the sages, not the saints of Byzantium, whom Yeats summons to be the singing masters of a poet who sought above all for the divine wisdom beyond any sect. Christians do not speak of sages, a word that refers rather to the Greek philosopher and, for Yeats himself, also to those of other traditions, those of India especially. O sages, standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from that holy fire, burn in a Gaia, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Yeats saw the works of the human imagination, the artifice of civilization, as a copy not of nature but of eternity, the timeless world of soul made according to the archetype on earth as it is in heaven, the task enjoined to humankind by the Lord Jesus himself. From that sacred wisdom, that unifying vision, flow all peripheral forms, as in the Irish holy books, themselves a flowering on the far margins of the civilized world, of the art of Byzantium, where the richness of golden lettering and the flowing design, where fish, flesh or fowl disport themselves in the joy of life. In his essay on the phases of history, in A Vision, entitled Dove or Swan, the dove of Christianity or the swan of Leda, from whose eggs came the Greek epic of Troy, Yeats gives his reasons for choosing Byzantium. At the moment when Byzantium became Byzantine and substituted for formal Roman magnificence with its glorification of physical power, an architecture that suggests the sacred city of the Apocalypse of St. John. I think if I could be given a month of antiquity and leave to spend it where I chose, I would spend it in Byzantium, a little before Justinian opened Santa Sophia and closed the Academy of Plato. I think I could find in some little wine shop some philosopher worker in mosaic who could answer all my questions, the supernatural descending nearer to him than to Plotinus even. I think that in early Byzantium, maybe never before or since in recorded history, religious, aesthetic, and practical life were one, the architect and artificers, though not, it may be, poets, for language had been the instrument of controversy and must have grown abstract, spoke to the multitude and the few alike. The painter, the mosaic worker, the worker in gold and silver, the illuminator of sacred books were almost impersonal, almost perhaps without the consciousness of individual design, absorbed in their subject matter, and that the vision of a whole people. They could copy out of old gospel books those pictures that seemed as sacred of the text, and yet weave all into a vast design, the work of many that seem the work of one, that make building, picture, pattern, metalwork of rail and lamp seem but a single image, and that vision, the proclamation of their invisible master, had the Greek nobility. And that for Yeats is civilization, whose unity is not a political but an imaginative unity from that shared vision of the universal archetype. In such a city, all humankind know ourselves to be citizens. Unity of being, Yeats elsewhere writes, is not possible where there is not also unity of culture. Christian culture came to its perfection in Byzantium, but Yeats found that same unity, or sensed it from afar, in India. In a late essay on the boiler, he expresses his admiration for India's caste system, which had, he writes, saved Indian intellect. In his introduction to Tagore's Gitanjali, he writes that these poems display in their thought a world I have dreamed of all my life long, the work of a supreme culture. They yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and the rushes. A tradition whose poetry and religion are the same thing has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned, metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and the noble. As the generations pass, travellers will hum them, Tagore's verses, on the highways, and men rowing upon rivers. Lovers, while they await one another, shall find in murmuring them this love of God, a magic gulf, wherein their own more bitter passion may bathe and renew its youth. At every moment, the heart of this poet flows outward to those without derogation or condescension, for it is known that they will understand. And this, Yeats continues, is no longer the sanctity of the cell or the scourge, being but a lifting up, as it were, into greater intensity of the mood of the painter, painting the dust and the sunlight with an insidious sweetness. From the sages of the holy wisdom, we pass to the golden birds and the golden foliage of artifice in the emperor's palace, type surely of all those palaces of folklore whose splendour is described in all the fairy tales of the world, from the poorest crofts and cabins of Western Ireland to the dark winters of Norway and Russia to the story of Aladdin. For poetry is the house of the soul, who inhabits all that fabulous magnificence. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enamelling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past and passing and to come. Here is Gibbon's description of the emperor's palace, which sounds more like a passage from one of the world's fairy tales than from a work of history. This is Gibbon, whom Yeats, by the way, bought Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire when he won the Nobel Prize. A throne resplendent with gold and gems was raised by a marble staircase to the height of a lofty terrace. Below the throne were seated the officers of his guards, the magistrates, the chiefs of the factions of the circus. The inferior steps were occupied by the people, and the place below was covered with troops of dancers, singers, and pantomimes. The square was surrounded by the Hall of Justice, the arsenal, and the various offices of business and pleasure. And the Purple Chamber was named from the annual distribution of robes of scarlet and purple by the hand of the Empress herself. The long series of apartments was adapted to the seasons and decorated with marble and porphyry, with painting, sculpture, and mosaics, with a profusion of gold, silver, and precious stones. His fanciful magnificence employed the skill and patience of such artists as the times could afford. And here Gibbon, who had little taste for works of the imagination and ranked generals and armies above philosophers and artists, cannot refrain from scorn. But the taste of Athens would have despised their frivolous but costly labours. A golden tree with its leaves and branches that sheltered a multitude of birds that warbled their artificial notes, and 2 lions of massy gold and of natural size who looked and roared like their brothers in the forest. The Caliph of Baghdad possessed the like. A tree of gold and silver spreading into 18 large branches, on which and on the lesser boughs sat a variety of birds made of the same precious metals, as well as the leaves of the tree, while the machinery effected spontaneous motions, the several birds warbled their natural harmony. Yeats saw Eastern, Persian influence in those golden vines whose tendrils climb everywhere and display among their leaves all those strange images of bird and beast, those forms that represent no creature eye has ever seen, yet are begotten one upon another as if they were themselves living creatures. Yeats might have been describing a page from one of Ireland's holy books, themselves reflecting the Byzantine style. Well, Gibbon may have despised such things, but not so the worldwide anonymous imagination that builds invisible palaces. Perhaps it would be better if the poor of the world all received washing machines and television sets, but we should remember that the price would be the inestimable treasuries of the imagination. The rarest diamonds are, after all, only pebbles, and pearls the secretions of an injured mollusk. It is the magic, the enchantment of imagination alone that creates all human splendour, as Yeats understood when he wrote his introduction to Lady Gregory's collection of Gods and Fighting Men, a book of Irish myths and legends. Children play at being great and wonderful people, at the ambitions they will put away for one reason and another before they grow into ordinary men and women. Mankind as a whole had a like dream once. Everybody and nobody built up the dream bit by bit, and the storytellers are there to make us remember. Yeats knew in the west of Ireland such people, poor in goods but rich in stories, and writes, "The poor fisher who has no possessions of the world and so no responsibility for it. And if he dreams of a love gift better than the brown shawl that seems too common for poetry, why should he not dream of a glove made of the skin of a bird, or shoes made from the skin of a fish, or a coat made from the glittering garment of the salmon? Homer himself found the great banquet on an earthen floor and under a broken roof. In the same foreword to Lady Gregory's book, he continues, I have read in a fabulous book that Adam had but to imagine a bird, and it was born into life, and that he created all things out of himself by nothing more important than an unflagging fancy. And whatever they do, the legendary people, whether they listen to the harp or follow an enchanter over the sea, they do it for the sake of joy. Now the second poem is a much more difficult poem, as you no doubt realise, and if any of you want to go now, before we embark on it, please do so. Byzantium, second poem. Byzantium was written in 1930, 3 years later than Sailing to Byzantium. It is a poem of magical power and beauty, but its meaning eludes the wish for explanation. And if I attempt to pursue a little further the meaning Yeats attached to the holier city of Byzantium, the Byzantium of his imagination, I may go astray. It must be understood, however, that any attempt to interpret Yeats in the light of current Western materialist ideologies or history of ideas is doomed to failure. Throughout his life, Yeats entirely repudiated the materialist ideologies then and now prevailing, and searched the available sources of an alternative cosmology, both in literature and in the experimental work of magic and psychical research. Finally, he came to a total commitment to Vedanta, and at the end of his life was engaged in making translations of the principal Upanishads with his Indian teacher Sri Purohit Swami. India was the end of his search for a philosophy both coherent and profound, whose ground is not matter but mind or spirit, and which embraces all opposites within its non-duality. His total rejection of current Western ideologies brought him ridicule from his younger contemporaries. It is no longer possible to reject Yeats's thought, as did George Orwell, as hocus pocus, or to say, in the words of an American critic of the time, that the supernatural has no part in our mental furniture. But that is not to say that his thought is better understood. Avoidance of the subject of those things which occupied Yeats's studies throughout his life is usual in academic discussions, unaware of the richness of the background of excluded knowledge on which Yeats was able to draw. From seeing him as a poet whose ideas were behind the time, lumber of the past, as the young Marxists of the 30s believed, we must see him as in advance of his time, prophetic perhaps of a change already beginning to be experienced in the West, of a search to rediscover spiritual knowledge, a quest which brought Yeats to the treasury of Indian wisdom, as it has brought many engaged in this same quest. But Yeats's elaborate symbol of the Gaias, received by him through the mediumship of his wife George, is grounded entirely in the Western tradition of pre-Socratic philosophers and Plato himself. In a letter written shortly before his death, he summarizes that symbol. To me, all things are made of the conflict of two states of consciousness, beings or persons, which die each other's life, live each other's death. That is true of life and death themselves. Two cones or whirls, the apex of each in the other's base. This symbol he attributes to Empedocles, who describes a perpetual alternation of concord and discord, and writes, "Never will boundless time be emptied of that pair, and they prevail in turn as the circle comes round, and pass away before each other, and increase in their appointed turn." And Yeats comments, "I recall that love and war come from the eggs of Leda, and he quotes Heraclitus, whose thought dominates all, and who writes that mortals are immortals, and immortals mortals, dying each other's life, living each other's death. Although Yeats does not mention Plato as a source of the symbol, it is unlikely that he did not also know Plato's parable in the Politicus of the alternations of the Golden Age and the Iron Age and the spiral revolutions of time. Plato writes, "Divinity himself sometimes conducts this universe in its progression and convolves it, but at another time he remits the reins of government when the periods of the universe have received a convenient measure of time, but the world is spontaneously led around to things contrary. The gyres move in contrary directions, one increasing as the other diminishes. Yeats plots in his chart 28 phases of the moon, and at phase 1 all is dark, the ascendancy of the earth-born race, the Kali Yuga, while at phase 15 the soul reaches its full beauty with the full moon, and both these phases are out of nature, the one in darkness and the other in light." In Byzantium, the poem takes up the theme of sailing to Byzantium, but this time less from the standpoint of the glory of the city of the 15th phase, the city of the soul, than as seen from the other world, the perspective not of the living, but of the immortals whose death we live, as they die our life. The great dome of Hagia Sophia we see not from within, where the sages stand in their holy fire on the mosaic walls, but in the light or darkness of that greater dome, the night sky. In the earlier poem, the poet had prayed to be freed from his mortal self, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. And now, as it seems, comes the moment of reversal of life and death, as the images of day recede, and the night sky opens. The unpurged images of day recede. The emperor's drunken soldiery are abed. Night resonance recedes, night walker's song, after great cathedral gong, a starlit or a moonlit dome disdains all that man is, all mere complexities, the fury and the mire of human veins. In sailing to Byzantium, the sages are summoned to come from the holy fire of God. Fire is the highest of the four elements, earth being the physical world, water the emotional element, air the intellectual, and fire the element of spirit, and to pern in a gyre, the gyre of history. Now the pern is a honey buzzard, a hawk, the bird already described in an earlier poem, The Second Coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, and the rest. I'm sure many of you know the poem by heart. It's a poem that speaks to our time. The falcon turns in the widening spiral of its flight, and the pern, in sailing to Byzantium, calls up the same image, except that the name of the bird, the pern, becomes a verb, to pern, a form used nowhere else in English literature but in Yeats's poem. In a still earlier poem, Shepherd and Goatherd, the pern becomes the spiral itself. Writing of the death of Major Robert Gregory, Yeats uses the symbol of the gyre as a spindle on which the thread of life is wound. This thread of fate is unwound in death, in the dreaming back of the discarnate soul, remembering its earthly life in the reverse order. He grows younger every second, jaunting, journeying to his own day spring. He unpacks the loaded pern of all 'twas joy or pain to learn. The loaded pern is equivalent to Plato's spindle in his bargain. Who talks of Plato's spindle? Who set it whirling round? Eternity may dwindle, time is unwound. Again eternity dwindles as the living travel their thread, wound by the fate of Lachesis, from the distaff of Clotho to be cut by the shear of Atropos. The process, so Yeats believed, is reversed in death. The image in Shepherd and Goatherd of the soul who grows younger every second echoes again Plato's Politicus. There may be other versions, in which Plato describes how the Iron Age men pass as now from birth to death, in the Golden Age from age to youth, or rather as the body ages the soul grows younger. Yeats develops this theme in his elaborate symbol of the dreaming back, in which the discarnate relive their lives in reverse order, as here Major Robert Gregory moves backward to his dayspring. In the second stanza of Byzantium, this image recurs in the unmistakable context of the dreaming back of the dead. Before me floats an image, man or shade, shade more than man, more image than a shade, for Hades' bobbin bound in mummy cloth may unwind the winding path. A mouth that has no moisture and no breath, breathless mouths may summon. I hail the superhuman, I call it death in life and life in death. We live their death, die their life. For who knows whether to live be not to die, and to die to live? Plato, Euripides, the Platonic tradition as a whole re-echoes these words. To Yeats, this teacher was fundamental to his understanding of the incarnate and discarnate states of the soul. Yeats is indeed saturated with this tradition, known to him from both Plato, Plotinus, and the pre-Socratics. Plato in the Phaedo makes Socrates say that true philosophers make dying their profession, because the philosopher will never attain to wisdom worthy of the name elsewhere than in the next world. Only death frees the soul from the contact with the body and its desires, which obscures the soul's innate wisdom. And in Blood and the Moon, Yeats summarizes Plato when he writes, "For wisdom is the property of the dead, a something incompatible with life, and power, like everything that has the stain of blood, a property of the living. But no stain can come upon the visage of the moon when it has looked in glory from a cloud." Yeats is here again speaking the 15th phase, the full moon of superhuman perfection. And one remembers Shelley's line in Adonais, "Die if thou wouldst be where thou desirest to be." Who then is the awesome image that floats before the poem? From a passage in Yeats's last work, The Death of Cuchulainn, it might seem that the image is himself. "There floats out there the shape that I shall take when I am dead, my soul's first shape, a soft, feathery shape. And is it not a strange shape for the soul of a great fighting man?" For a lifetime, Yeats had speculated on the discarnate life of the soul, and in a vision writes that religion cannot answer the atheist, and philosophy talks about a first cause or a final purpose, when we would know what we were a little before conception, what we shall be a little after burial, becomes Hades' bobbin bound in mummy cloth. For the symbol of the reversal of the gyres is here applied not to history, but to the alternation of life and death. Hades and the mummy cloth tell us no less. Another possibility I venture to suggest, but very tentatively, since the poem is entitled Byzantium, it seems to me likely that the symbols would allude to the iconography of that city, and what more central to the civilization of Christendom than Christ on the cross. Since the central teaching of Christianity is that Christ conquered death, that he descended into hell and returned, what symbol more apt to float before the poet as an emblem of the ruler of the two kingdoms of the living and the dead? The icon of Christ on the cross is both man and shade, at once in life and in death, and also more image than a shade, because less historical than an imaginative reality. Now, it so happened that I found, by sheer chance, only yesterday, a passage which I hadn't included in this nature, in which Yeats states his own homage to Christianity. It's from a general introduction for my work, written in 1937, quite near the end of Yeats's life. And it seems to me to confirm this suggestion that the image is that of Christ on the cross. He writes, "A Christ posed against a background of Druidism, not shut off in dead history, but flowing, concrete, and phenomenal." That is Yeats's Christ. "I was born into this faith, have lived in it, and shall die in it. My Christ, legitimate as I is legitimate as I think, is that unity of being Dante compared to a perfectly proportioned human body, Blake's imagination, what the Upanishads have named the self. And he believes that this, my Christ, is a legitimate deduction from the creed of St. Patrick. And this is, as it were, Yeats's own declaration of faith. Blake, of course, said all religions are one and identified Jesus with the imagination. This is what Yeats is here referring to. So, for all the fact that Yeats was a student of, above all, of Vedanta at the end of his life, that did not for him exclude Christianity. And the icon of the Christos has power for us, not because it commemorates a historical event, but because it is a vision of eternal reality. So at least it would have seemed to Yeats, who chose that Byzantine art where around a bare cross all the rest is bird and beast and trees, and we may discover an Asiatic art dear to those who thought Christ contained nothing human. A poem on the theme of Byzantium can scarcely disregard the inner universe, the sacred dimension of the city. What indeed can be said of a city or a civilization that excludes that other world? A secular city confined to the needs and activities of the dying animal would not have been called by Yeats a holy city. I'm sorry I read that so badly. It's my own handwriting in pencil. But I hope you got the point of Yeats's Christ being conformable to the creed of St. Patrick. And of course, as an Irishman, this was the what he would refer to. And those of you who heard John Carey's splendid lectures about the Celtic otherworld will pick up those resonances also. The third stanza returns to the theme of art that first appeared in Sailing to Byzantium. Again we have those golden birds, but with two new themes introduced, the themes of miracle and Hades, the otherworld. Miracle, bird or golden handiwork, more miracle than bird or handiwork, planted on the starlit golden bough, can like the cocks of Hades crow, or by the moon embittered scorn aloud, common bird and petal, and all complexities of mire and blood. The poet is here speaking of something beyond either living bird or metal bird, that is, miracle. The work of art is more miracle than bird or handiwork. Gibbon observed that Byzantine civilization replaced reason, which had ruled the classical world, with a faith in the miraculous, that is, in the continual possibility or reality of divine intervention in earthly events. Gibbon scorns whatever does not conform to rational thought, but not so Yeats, who, like Blake before him, held imagination above reason. This century is familiar with the reality of an unconscious or a superconscious self and knows that the reach of imagination goes far beyond rational conscious thought. In the section of his autobiographies entitled Hodos Chameleontos, The Way of the Chameleon, Yeats has declared his belief in revelation. I know now that revelation is from the self, but from that age-long memoried self that shapes the elaborate shell of the mollusk and the child in the womb, that teaches the birds to make their nest, and that genius is a crisis that joins that buried self for certain moments to our trivial daily mind. Blake would have called that divine inspirer Jesus the imagination. Yeats understood it in the symbol of the miraculous 15th phase of the moon, which unites the two worlds. Those beings of the inner worlds of the mundus imaginalis are the breathless mouths of the gods, the divine moods that inhabit the human mind. They are the she of the Irish otherworld. And when the moon's full, those creatures of the full are met on the waste hills by countrymen who shudder and hurry by. In A Vision, Yeats writes of this change from the Roman to the Byzantine civilization in terms of sculpture. He noted that the Greeks painted the eyes of marble statues, but the Roman was the first to drill a round hole to represent the pupil, and because I think of a preoccupation with the glance, characteristic of a civilization in its final phase. But the Byzantine vision was no representation of a living world, but the dream of a somnambulist. Even the drilled pupil of the eye, when the drill is in the hand of some Byzantine worker in ivory, undergoes a somnambulistic change, for its deep shadow among the faint lines of the tablet, its mechanical circle where all else is rhythmical and flowing, gives to saint or angel a look of some great bird staring at miracle. It is in Byzantium that for the first time in the West, a civilization of the inner worlds, of the mundus imagination, has come into being. You see how wonderfully Yeats conceals his sources, some great bird staring at miracle. He never mentions Gibbon, but it's Gibbon he got it from, this thing of the Byzantine preoccupation with the miraculous. And the difference between Yeats and Eliot, or one difference between Yeats and Eliot, there are many others, is that whereas Yeats gives footnotes and references to all the things like Jessie Weston and Measure for Measure and so on, Yeats very carefully conceals them so that it all flows so naturally, and yet when you look into Yeats, you find how immense his learning was. It is in Byzantium that for the first time in the West, a civilization of the inner worlds has come into being, and the passage continues, could any visionary of those days, passing through the church named with so untheological a grace, the holy wisdom, can even a visionary of today, wandering among the mosaics of Rome and Sicily, fail to recognize some one magic image seen under his closed eyelids? To me it seems that he, who among the first Christian communities was little but a ghostly exorcist, had by his ascent to a full divinity made possible this sinking in upon supernatural splendor, these walls with their little glimmering cubes of blue and green and gold. Artifice is not mere skill, it is miracle. And that miracle is the revelation of a vision of the supernatural splendor of the inner worlds of the human imagination that every holy city seeks to embody. The soul of the earthly splendor of Byzantium was the vision of the Christos. The song of the golden birds has become the crow of the cocks of Hades, a voice of the other world. It proclaimed that awesome wisdom which is the property of the dead and scorns all complexities of mire and blood, of that mortal heart Yeats had dedicated to be consumed away in God's holy fire as Dante stepped into the flames of purgatory. In the stanzas that follow, the poet evokes, in the exalted language of an initiate, the power of the imagination to summon from the imaginal world the miraculous fire, at that magical moment, midnight, which unites the sleeping and the waking mind, the world of the human and the superhuman, of the blood-begotten spirits of the living and the spirits of flame begotten of flame, the breathless Mars of the spirits of the other world. At midnight, on the emperor's pavement flit flames that no faggot feeds, nor steel has lit, nor storm disturbs, flame begotten of flame, where blood-begotten spirits come, and all complexities of fury leave, dying into a dance, an agony of trance, an agony of flame that cannot singe a sleeve. Here the poet transports us into the mundus imaginalis itself, that inner universe of poetry and dreams that all forms of magic and enchantment sing to bring into consciousness. Rites and ceremonies, Yeats himself, as a member of a magical order, had performed and experienced. Here we irresistibly think of the emperor of Byzantium not as Constantine or Justinian, but of the emperor, the taro key, which Yeats must have used in magical ceremonies of evocation of that inner world. It is on the pavement of this world that the blood-begotten spirits of incarnate humanity meet the immortal moods in the fire of inspiration, which is at once a death of the trivial daily mind of the mortal self and an agony of flame, as mortality is consumed away. Yeats had written in an early essay appended to the second volume of Lady Gregory's Visions and Beliefs of that interworld, which is the region of the seance and of apparitions of the fairy folk to the country people of Western Ireland, as it is the theme of the Japanese No theatre, and Yeats describes the ghost character of Motomezuka, who has but to lay her hand upon a pillar to make it burst into flame. She was perpetually burning. Japanese drama takes place in that interworld, whose flames cannot singe a sleeve, and are yet realities of the imaginal world. A clue to this dance between mortals and immortals is to be found in an early story, Rosa Alchemica, based no doubt upon Yeats's experience of magical work. In this story, Yeats points out the independent reality of our thoughts, which are nevertheless the divine powers he calls the moods. Shapes barely out of existence, folding up into a timeless ecstasy, drifting with half-shut eyes into a sleepy stillness. The bodiless souls who descend into these forms were what men call the moods, and worked all great changes in the world. In this way, all the great events were accomplished. A mood, a divinity, or a demon, first descending like a faint sigh into men's minds, and then changing their thoughts and their actions, and empires moved their borders as though they were but drifts of leaves. Here, there is a clear echo of Blake's description of the timeless moment of inspiration in his poem Milton. For in this period the poet's work is done, and all the great events of time stand forth and are conceived in such a period, within a moment, a pulsation of the artery. There follows a magical dance between mortals and immortals. For a moment the narrator seemed to be a mask which many persons with eyes so bright and still that I knew them for more than human came and tried me on their faces. For the poet is only the mask which the immortal moods put on or off for their drama. Then I opened the door and found myself in a marvellous passage, along whose sides were many divinities wrought in a mosaic, not less beautiful than the baptistry at Ravenna, but of a less severe beauty. Here Yeats is describing the character of his own imaginative world, of which the mosaics of Byzantium are the nearest approximation. Then a voice cried out, "Is the work of the incorruptible fire at an end?" And immediately Michael Robartes replied, "The perfect gold has come from the Athanor." Thus we may conclude that the flames that no faggot feeds of Byzantium are by implication the furnaces of the alchemical transmutation in whose agony the base metal of mortality is transmuted into alchemical gold. In the dance that followed, and in which the narrator is now qualified to take part, every mortal foot danced by the white foot of an immortal. I was dancing with an immortal woman who had black lilies in her hair, and her dreaming gesture seemed laden with a wisdom more profound than is the darkness between star and star. In Byzantium, the poet has condensed his early romantic fantasy into 8 lines of magical power. The last stanza introduces 2 new symbols, the dolphin and the smithies of the emperor. Astraddle the dolphin's mire and blood, spirit after spirit. The smithies break the flood, the golden smithies of the emperor. Marble of the dancing floor, break bitter furies. Marbles of the dancing floor, break bitter furies of complexity. Those images that yet fresh images beget. That dolphin torn, that gong-tormented sea. The dolphin, often found on Greco-Roman sarcophagi, is that vehicle which carries the souls of the dead to the other world and generating souls to this world. In a later poem, News from the Delphic Oracle, the dolphins are the vehicles of the dead. Straddling each a dolphin's back and steadied by a fin, those innocents relive their death, their wounds open again. The ecstatic waters laugh because their cries are sweet and strange. Through their ancestral patterns dance, and the brute dolphins plunge until in some cliff-sheltered bay where wades the choir of love, proffering its sacred laurel crowns, they pitch their burdens off. The Emperor of Byzantium, or the Taro Emperor of the world, must have had his smithies where the hammered gold and gold enamelling was wrought, so that the invisible archetype be made visible, and we again think of Blake's furnaces of loss, the spirit who kept the divine vision, where some sons of loss surround the passions with porches of iron and silver, creating form and beauty around the dark regions of sorrow, giving to airy nothing a name and a habitation delightful, with bounds to the infinite, putting off the indefinite into most holy forms of thought, such is the power of inspiration. They labour incessant, with many tears and afflictions, creating the beautiful house for the piteous sufferer. Others cabinets richly fabricate with gold and ivory, for doubts and fears, unformed and wretched and melancholy. So in the smithies of imagined Byzantium, as in Blake's furnaces of loss, those works of beauty are created, without which there is only the many-headed foam. Yeats admonished his own nation, the Irish. It was for the sages standing round God's holy fire in Byzantium that Yeats summoned to travel the gyres of history and to be his teachers, for Byzantium was a city of the arts. Yeats's master, William Blake, had written that the arts of imagination, poetry, painting, music, the three powers of man, in man of conversing with paradise, which the flood did not sweep away, and wrote of the labourers in the furnaces of loss, the time spirit, with bounds to the infinite, putting off the indefinite, the sea of time and space. And so Yeats in the statues sets art against chaos, furnaces against the sea. We Irish born into that ancient sect, but thrown upon this filthy modern tide, and by its formless spawning fury wrecked, climb to our proper dark, that we may trace the lineaments of a plummet measured face. The vision of all great cities comes from that fertile darkness, for who can distinguish darkness from the soul? Beauty is not a decoration of material wealth, but the source, the soul of every true civilization, and without that vision of beauty, civilizations perish. Such was Yeats's reflection on the theme of civilization, on the theme of that universal city of which Plato dreamed, the city coming down out of heaven from God of St. John's Apocalypse. The human city must have a soul, an inspiring vision, or it will be mere building. All will be chaos again, the bitter furies of complexity that are held in check by the smithies of the emperor, the marbles of the dancing floor, where mortals meet immortal spirits, those images that yet fresh images beget. The soul of the earthly splendour of Byzantium was the Christian vision, the invisible master of miracle. By attempting to place some of Yeats's great resonant symbols in their context, I hope I may have suggested something of the great imaginative scope of his poetic thought, to which I would only wish to add that however great the resonance of his symbolic images, these are always firmly rooted in earthly reality, even that great Homeric line, that dolphin torn, that gong tormented sea. Just as the great cathedral gong of Hagia Sophia tormented the waters of the Sea of Marmara, so, Mrs. Yeats told me, the fishermen of the west of Ireland attract fish to their nets by beating a sheet of iron, a gong, whose vibrations attract the shoals of their mackerel-crowded seas. However the resonance of a symbolic image may travel into the superhuman and the miraculous regions of imagination, every great poet respects the law of correspondence, which in every great work unites the sensible image and the invisible worlds it evokes and manifests. Thank you. Well, William Blake, prophetic voice of England. For more than half my long life, my studies have been concerned with William Blake. If I were an academic, I would say that Blake has been my subject. But being myself a poet, it is more true to say that Blake has been my master, in the Oriental sense of that word, and I hope I have served him well, thrown a degree of light to my contemporaries upon his profound thought and the complex and obscure mythological organism of his entire work, both his writings and his paintings and engravings, which together form an indivisible whole. Be that as it may, I must begin what I have to say in the traditional Oriental manner of acknowledging my debt of gratitude to the teacher, to whom I owe more than to any other among the great names of the Western tradition, Plato and Plotinus, in my own country, Shakespeare's inexhaustible riches, Milton, whom Blake himself so revered, Shelley, who alone of Blake's contemporaries drew upon many of the same sources within the one ununanimous and universal tradition of wisdom, and W.B. Yeats, Blake's first editor and greatest disciple. Indeed, I am not alone in my generation or the younger generations that follow in holding Blake's prophetic writings, for so he describes them, among the sacred books from which I have learned what those in my time and place have most needed to know. Indeed, the very phrase, the New Age, now current in the westernized world, is surely taken from Blake's introduction to his poem Milton, in which he calls to the young men of the New Age to rouse up and wake to a new vision stirring in the world. Blake was himself born in 1757, in which year the Swedish visionary Swedenborg declared that a new church had come into being, the Church of the New Jerusalem. Blake was, both at the beginning and at the end of his life, deeply influenced by Swedenborg and saw himself as the voice of that new age which had begun in the year of his birth. There are works of transforming power whose influence operates, it may be, on whole civilizations, like the Jewish Bible, the Quran, the Christian Gospels. And within these larger contexts, what one must call minor prophets. Blake called his writings and poems prophetic books. He is the sole English poet to have made such a claim, nor could such a claim be made for any other English poet. He remains the one English religious prophet. What is more, it is only in this century that the transforming power of his writings has manifested itself and continues to do so among a younger generation who would in general accept the values of the so-called New Age. This embraces the great numbers looking not for progress and development according to the received values of our scientific materialist civilization, but for a reversal of the premises of that civilization, of the very grounds and assumptions on which it is established. René Guénon, the French metaphysician, who at the beginning of this century made his radical challenge to the very premises of Western civilization, called our age the reign of quantity. Blake had made the same radical challenge a century before, not as a theorist, but from the very heart of life itself. No other poet, neither Wordsworth, nor Coleridge, nor Byron, had done so. Shelley alone, who likewise challenged current values in the name of poetic truth, may indeed have known something of Blake's writings through his marriage to Mary Godwin, daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, whom Blake had known and two of whose books he had illustrated. During his lifetime, Blake's prophetic books remained unpublished and existed only in the beautiful illuminated copies he made by a method of printing he himself invented, selling copies to a few friends. It was only a century later that their power began to operate on a generation themselves beginning to call in question the premises of the mighty structure of a materialist civilization which has yielded such evident benefits in the sphere of technology. Blake lived and died in poverty, although he was known and honored among his fellow artists and by a group of young disciples, including Samuel Palmer and Calvert and others, who called themselves the Shoreham Ancients, affirming their adherence to ancient and traditional sacred values as against the moderns, who then as now were prepared to discard the wisdom of ages and put their trust in the new scientific experimental method. Blake's rich and complex works can be studied from many standpoints in the context of the revolutionary political events of his age, in the light of modern psychology, especially that of C.G. Jung, which casts much light upon Blake's mythology of the inner worlds, the fourfold structure of the human soul, whose energies he personified as his four zoas, living creatures of sense perception, feeling, reason, and vision, and his spiritual fourfold London, the city of Golgonooza, whose structure is also fourfold. I have myself made studies in some of Blake's most important sources, Plotinus and other of the Neoplatonic writings, translated by his contemporary Thomas Taylor the Platonist. Indeed, Blake can be seen, in a certain sense, as influenced by the Greek revival at the end of the 18th century. Jakob Böhmer, the great German Protestant mystic, Swedenborg, Paracelsus, Blake himself names as his sources. But I shall attempt only to present the main outline of what I believe to be the essence, the underlying structure of Blake's traditional yet revolutionary and transformative thought. For the perennial wisdom is itself revolutionary in an age that has lost its orientation to the abiding source. Obscure as he remained throughout his life, Blake yet saw himself as a national prophet, not, as his first editor W.B. Yeats was later to be, an initiate of esoteric knowledge, and Blake never doubted that his work concerned his nation. Truth cannot be spoken so as to be understood and not be believed, he wrote. And in the descriptive catalogue of his one exhibition of paintings, held in 1809, he addressed himself to the public, as against the professional critics of the day, whose narrow blinking eyes have too long governed art in a dark corner. Sounds very contemporary. Only a few copies of that catalogue were sold, and yet time has been on Blake's side, and he has become a revered national and indeed international figure. And he writes, "There cannot be more than 2 or 3 great painters or poets in any age or country, and these, in a corrupt state of society, are easily excluded, but not so easily obstructed. If art is the glory of a nation, if genius and inspiration are the great origin and bond of society, the distinction my works have obtained from those who best understand such things calls for my exhibition as the greatest of duties to my country, and the ignorant insults of individuals will not hinder me from doing my duty to my art." These are not the words of a mystical dreamer, a poet living in some private world. He assumed the prophetic role not as a private but as a public task. Blake's appeal to the public has been in the long run heard, and his name in England is a household name. His call to build Jerusalem, the holy city, in England's green and pleasant land, on all lips, virtually a national anthem. The Oxford English Dictionary describes a prophet as one who speaks for God. The role is a public one. The prophet speaks to his nation or to mankind as a whole on matters of universal concern, and his claim to divine inspiration is not questioned by those civilizations who recognize a supreme mind from which truths may be revealed to humankind, may inspire its recipients with cosmic knowledge. In the absence of any such belief, in the context of a civilization dedicated to a materialist ideology already well established in Blake's lifetime, the claim to prophecy can only be meaningless. Blake was unheeded by his contemporaries or dismissed as a sort of madman. Yet his claim was clear, and the God for whom he speaks is the God within, the inner light of the Protestant mystical tradition, the universal spirit of the divine humanity. Such was the term Blake used. At this time, the individual mind of multitudes of human egos is paramount. Psychologists, both Freudian and Jungian, make individuation their goal, whereas in traditional civilization it was rather the purpose of prayer and meditation to open the individual to the universal mind. If genius and inspiration are the great origin and bond of society, and such was Blake's belief, shared by few in his own or perhaps any age. Shelley has called poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Such a belief in genius and inspiration imposes on poetry the role of prophecy, speaking for the universal mind on matters of this world, and prophetic truth will always prevail. Current fashion is for ego poetry, affirming each individual's narrow vision without regard or even the possibility of access to a greater mind. If Blake and Shelley believe in poets as the unacknowledged legislators and poetic genius as the bond of society, this is because the final and ultimate arbiter of truth is this God within Blake calls the imagination, whose awakening in any individual or in humanity as a whole passes the final judgment on personal acts and national acts. This is the last judgment, which is the theme of a great unfinished painting on which Blake was engaged to the end of his life, and on which he has written a long and illuminating commentary. Jesus, the imagination, appears as the judge. The work is in many details based upon Michelangelo's great painting in the Sistine Chapel, but its mystical content differs in essentials from Michelangelo's conception of the judge appearing as a human person to acquit or condemn mortal men. Blake's Last Judgment is interiorized and has nothing to do with the end of time. It is a last judgment because it is in its nature final and unanswerable when the highest arbiter within our own nature passes judgment on our finite mortal selves, so highly prized in the modern world, our personalities. Thus, when the Last Judgment begins, its vision is seen by the imaginative eye of every one according to the situation he holds. It is the judgment of truth and reality on every kind of error and self-deception. In an early work entitled All Religions Are One, 1788, Blake makes it clear that he sees the poetic genius as nothing less than the prophetic gift. And I quote, "The religions of all nations are derived from each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, which is everywhere called the spirit of prophecy. The Jewish and Christian testaments are an original derivation from the poetic genius. This is necessary from the confined nature of bodily sensation. As all men are alike, though infinitely various, so all religions, as all similars, have one source. The true man is the source, he being the poetic genius. Who then are we, and who this true man who is called the poetic genius and the spirit of prophecy? Blake's true man is not the bodily man, nor the empirical ego, but the God within, whom he calls the imagination, and Blake being a Christian, Jesus, the imagination, and the divine humanity. It is the divine humanity present in all that is the source of truth and the judge before whom all must stand. And that, of course, is the self of the Upanishads, of the Hindu religious tradition. In affirming that all religions are one, Blake is carrying his belief in the divine humanity, who is the true self in all, to its ultimate conclusion. In affirming that Jesus is God, he is by no means speaking as a Christian fundamentalist, for he declares that antiquity taught the religion of Jesus, which religion was the universal truth which Jesus had taught, and by no means to be equated with the exoteric teachings of the church or churches. In his bold restatement of the Christian teaching, Blake had the authority of the 18th century Swedish visionary Emanuel Swedenborg, from whom indeed Blake adopted the term the divine humanity, which he has made so much his own that few of his readers are aware that in this and much besides, Blake is following the teachings of Swedenborg. Indeed, Swedenborg's vision of the divine humanity, whom he describes as the grand man of the heavens, that is, of the inner worlds, is of great splendor, being the many in one and one in many of all humankind, who, from a distance, appears as one man, but from near at hand, so Swedenborg puts it, is seen to be made up of the innumerable multitudes of eternity. This grand man, Blake, Swedenborg also, identifies with Jesus, the imagination, the poetic or prophetic genius. But Swedenborg says that to many who have no knowledge of Jesus, he is recognized by other names as the Lord. This universal Christ is the regenerative divine presence in all, by whose virtue each and every individual has access to the divine presence. But you may say, how can this innate divinity be equated with the poetic genius, or the poetic genius equated with the prophetic gift, which imparted the law to Moses, the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad, his teachings to the Lord Buddha? All sacred traditions recognize a number of levels through which the divine life flows into the created world, and in such societies it is recognized that poets may be inspired from higher or lower regions of the mental worlds. Blake conceded that art, not of a prophetic character, was seldom without some vision, but he is insistent throughout his writings that one thing alone makes a poet: imagination, the divine vision. There are many degrees between the great prophetic writings that have inspired whole civilizations and the glimpses and flashes that come to us all, however rarely. But the reality discerned in such glimpses is the same reality as is more fully set forth in the great revelatory visions, and has nothing in common with the secular works which are self-expression of the ego and its various degrees of alienation from this vision of a greater reality. Indeed, it is because the one truth is written in us all that we respond to the sacred writings of all religious traditions, and also to the great poets, Shakespeare, Dante, or Rumi, or the great epics of India, or of all nations. It is a modern misapprehension that poets, musicians, architects, or indeed scientists and mathematicians are the originators of their works, that poets invent their poems or musicians their music. Rather, in moments of inspiration, they perceive the realities their works embody. It is recorded that Dante perceived in such a moment the entire structure of his Divine Comedy, which he thereafter wrote over a period of years. In the same way, Mozart received his musical inspiration as wholes, which he thereafter wrote out in detail. Those who ask how Shakespeare could have known so much about all kinds and classes of people overlook the nature of inspiration. It is said that Shakespeare never blotted a line, but wrote at great speed and without reflection, which suggests that, like Dante and Mozart, he had, when he wrote, access to that inspiration which comes not from individual memory, but from universal mind. Spirit, according to St. Paul, Corinthians 2, searcheth all things, Blake himself claimed that his prophetic poems were often given to him from immediate dictation, 12 or sometimes 20 or 30 lines at a time, without premeditation and even against my will. The time it has taken in writing was thus rendered non-existent, and an immense poem exists, which seems to be the labor of a long life, all produced without labor or study. Those who have experience of imaginative thought will have no difficulty in believing Blake when, in more eloquent and figurative language, he writes, "In my brain are studies and chambers filled with books and pictures of old, which I wrote and painted in ages of eternity before my mortal life. And these works are the delight and study of archangels." This surely is what Plato means by anamnesis, that all knowledge is remembering what we already and forever know. Blake was surely describing the access to the collective or universal mind, of which the individual is, in Blake's words, but a form and organ, the agent and recipient. It is true that few works issue from this high source, but it is these which have their origin in that deep knowledge that speak wisdom to all times and places by virtue of the universal nature of the divine truth and divine beauty which all share and recognize, in which all participate. Poetry and the other arts are, therefore, when they so originate, communications of the deepest wisdom of which the mind of the empirical ego is incapable. It is characteristic of Blake that he spoke with a down-to-earth simplicity. He writes in Milton, "There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find." Satan is the mind of the ego, Satan the selfhood. "There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply, and when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed." This is the moment of inspiration, and at the end of a passage building up a great edifice of the wondrous buildings of time through the 6,000 years of the world's history, Blake concludes, "Every time less than the pulsation of an artery is equal in its period and value to 6,000 years. For in this period the poet's work is done, and all the great events of time stand forth and are conceived in such a period, within a moment, the pulsation of the artery." This knowledge belongs not to history, to time, to experience, but to the cosmos. Nor is it only poets and musicians who are thus inspired, but scientists, mathematicians, all imaginative thinkers. Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, who spoke to the Institute of Architecture students in November 1993, told me afterwards that in her writings on the mathematical structure of the Hindu temples were not at all her own invention. "One day I just saw it," she said. These forms, be they temples or poems or any other structures within the cosmic whole, exist in their own right within inexhaustible reality. We do not invent, but perceive them. It is because the one reality is written also in us that we respond to such works, which serve in Platonic terms to remind us, as we do to the Holy Scriptures of whatever religion, or indeed to the deep insights of such poets as Shakespeare and Dante and Rumi, or to the Mahabharata. And it is surely only in the modern West that poetry and the sacred have become separated, and the very idea of secular art has made its appearance, art without inspiration. Blake, so far as I know, is alone in his country, in his century, in declaring that the inspiration of the poet and prophet are one and the same, and the source of that inspiration, the divine, human, innate in all. In fact, the separation of the divine and the human is an article of Christian faith from which only a few mystics have deviated, like Eckhart, whose works were banned by the papacy for declaring the divine principle to be within. Sufi mystics have been executed for saying as much, although in India the words tat tvam asi, that art thou, is a fundamental principle of Hindu sacred writings. But Blake is a prophet of the modern world who have nothing to fear but neglect and incomprehension. It may well seem strange, indeed unacceptable, to the religious, thus to identify the prophetic with the poetic gift, to affirm that the great religions of the world are each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, that the human imagination is the source alike of poetry and prophecy. What is a church and what is a theatre, he asks. Are they two and not one? Surely this is to place the works of Shakespeare among the sacred books. The Protestant Reformation rested on the dawning realization that the inner light, and not the church, is the ultimate authority. But Blake carried this realization to its logical conclusion, so far as I know unprecedented in the modern West, though what he affirmed would have caused no surprise to those Oriental thinkers for whom the universal and individual self are the same. In the mystical philosophy of Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, besides certain Gnostic Christians condemned by the Church, a comparable understanding is to be found. In the Indian subcontinent, religion and art have been inseparably united until modern Western secular ideas invaded that ancient unity of culture. There is a world of difference between religious art in the modern West, which since the Renaissance has often taken the form of mere narrative illustrations of religious stories and personages, and sacred art in the true sense of art inspired by a vision of the numinous in whatever mode. In the whole phenomenon of the sacred icons of the Orthodox Christian tradition, or indeed in the Gothic cathedrals established on sacred principles of geometry and number, religious art is true sacred art also. But in the centuries following the Renaissance, the arts have moved ever further from any idea that a vision of the sacred is a necessary ground for any work of art. And yet, Blake wrote, one thing alone makes a poet, imagination, the divine vision. Such a definition gives to the arts an essential function as the language in which that divine vision is communicated from the inner to the outer world, where the arts so inspired in turn remind us of that imaginative knowledge innate in all, our shared inheritance, accessible, Plato taught, by recollection, anamnesis, unforgetting. Blake continually affirms the sacred function of the arts in this sense, but in so doing he is by no means making a religion of art in the sense of those artists of the late 19th century who proclaimed the value of art for art's sake. Quite the contrary, it is by virtue of their function as the language of vision of sacred things that the arts have value. Poetry, painting, and music, the three powers in man of conversing with paradise, which the flood did not sweep away. The flood, symbolically understood as the sea of time and space, which submerges the higher consciousness of humankind, the omniscient God within, enthroned in every human soul. Around the throne, heaven is opened, and the nature of eternal things displayed, all springing from the divine humanity, all beams from him, as he himself has said, all dwells in him. The person on the throne, Blake names Jesus the imagination. In other sacred traditions, there are other names for the same reality. Such a view of art is not possible in terms of a materialist civilization, for it presumes the recognition that within reality and within man there are other levels than that which forms the sole basis of our materialist Western civilization, whose mentality seems constitutionally unable to grasp the possibility that the measurable material world is not the ground and whole of reality. For the Oriental religions, it is equally self-evident that the perceiving mind and not the object perceived is a more fundamental principle. The innate assurance of the materialist mentality is illustrated by the story of Dr. Johnson, thinking he had answered the arguments of the immaterialist philosopher Berkeley when he kicked a stone, saying, "Thus I refute him." There are many to this day who would still see this act of common sense as a valid refutation, but to modern physics, stones are no longer as solid as they were in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the same way, many Westerners engaged in the study of artificial brains are unable to grasp the difference between the brain, a physical organ, or a machine simulating the brain, and consciousness itself, a difference not in degree but in kind between the measurable and the immeasurable. W.B. Yeats, who was Blake's first editor and greatest disciple, wrote that the mischief began at the end of the 17th century, when man became passive before a mechanized nature. That lasted to our own day, with the exception of a brief period when imprisoned man beat on the door. Blake was, of course, the great mind who refused to allow imagination to be passive before the mechanized nature of Newton and Locke. He called himself, indeed, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, using the words of the Gospel describing John the Baptist, when he proclaimed his prophetic message of the primacy of the imagination. The true faculty of knowledge must be the faculty which experiences. This faculty I treat of. These words would cause little surprise east of Suez, on the Indian subcontinent, or in the Buddhist world, but one sees little evidence that they are better understood in the West than in Blake's lifetime, unless perhaps by the most advanced physicists themselves. But I am not qualified to digress into a discussion of scientific theory. To return to Blake, then, his contribution to the Western mystical tradition is radical and twofold. 1. Religions are declared to originate through the human imagination, which receives the wisdom of higher worlds. 2. Poetry and the other arts are placed in the same order of imaginative vision as are religious revelations. The difference is not of kind, but of degree, and both alike are visions of truth and reality. The visions of the imagination are not imaginary in the common sense of the word, fictitious and unreal, and the great Ismaili scholar Henri Corbin has coined the word imaginal to indicate this difference. The imaginal is an interworld through which meanings and values are embodied in forms communicable in this world. Because Blake equated Jesus with the imagination, he declares in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell that Jesus and his apostles and disciples were all artists, not because they practiced some art or craft, but because they acted from inspiration at all times. I tell you, no virtue can exist without breaking these 10 commandments. Jesus was all virtue and acted from impulse, not from rules. Thus, while other religions, and indeed the Christian Church also, teach various methods of prayer and meditation as a means of conversing with paradise, Blake preferred the practice of the arts as a form of what elsewhere would be called yoga. He speaks, as always, boldly, simply, and unambiguously. A poet, a painter, a musician, an architect, the man or woman who is not one of these is not a Christian. You must leave fathers and mothers and houses and lands if they are in the way of art. Prayer is the study of art. Praise is the practice of art. Fasting, etc., all relate to art. The outward ceremony is Antichrist. The eternal body of man is the imagination that is God himself, the divine body, Jesus. We are his members. It manifests itself in his works of art. In eternity, all is vision. In the same work on the angel of the divine presence, illustrating a drawing of the Laocoon, he further declares, art degraded, imagination denied, war governed the nations. Art is degraded in a world which denies the sacred source and sacred function of the arts, be these the fine arts or the simplest crafts of cooking, carpentry, all the making and doing of human hands. And this is inevitable in a world for which reality is equated with the material order, and that order seen not as a living, but as a mechanistic world. We have seen the decline of the arts in the modern West and westernized world from, to take only English poetry as an example, the total spiritual context of Milton to the personal devotion of the metaphysical poets Vaughan and Traherne, to the Augustan poets, Dryden and Pope, for whom reason was supreme, to the descriptive Victorians, and finally to Marxist social realism. And in our own worlds, the camera eye, a mechanism, not a perceiving being. They don't even have the idealism of Marxism. It is just a mechanical process. The camera is the typical perceiving mind of our age. And there is little poetry in modern poetry, thus denuded of values and meanings, which are no part of passivity before a mechanized nature. And yet we see a counter-movement among the younger generation who speak of the new age, and Blake would surely have been glad to see so many of the sons and daughters of Albion seeking to rediscover what has been lost, their own humanity. It was Blake himself who first used the phrase, the new age, and in his preface to Milton, which I've already mentioned, he wrote, "Rouse up, O young men of the new age, and demolish these new men, and admonishes these new men to reject those who depress mental and prolong corporeal war." And he continues by summoning painters, sculptors, and architects to be true to our own imagination, those worlds of eternity. And there follows the poem the whole English nation knows as Jerusalem, summoning the people to build Jerusalem, the holy city, in England's green and pleasant land. The passage ends with a quotation from the book of Numbers, "Would to God that all the Lord's people were prophets." Such was the program Blake set his nation. Blake made many illustrations of religious themes from the Bible and from the New Testament, besides poems of Dante, Milton, Greek mythology, and the visionary world of Swedenborg. But for him, everything that lives is holy, and his vision of the sacred is summed up in those 4 familiar lines: to see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. Perhaps Blake's greatest single work is his 22 engravings illustrating the Book of Job, made late in his life, in the year 1825. You are probably familiar with these small but inexhaustibly rich works, and you will remember how they conduct Job, that good man, from the prosperity of his first state, through the progressive devastation of his world and his own reduction to near despair, to the vision of God, which restores to him more than he had lost, in a deeper understanding of the divine nature. In the first plate, we see Job and his wife, his sons and daughters, his sheep and lands as far as the eye can see, seated under the great tree of life, studying the scriptures, all immobile, like a Victorian family portrait taken on the Sabbath day, when man is enjoined to do no manner of work. Behind this pious group, on the spreading branches of the tree of life, hang musical instruments, unnoticed and unused. Under the engraving the words are written, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." Job's religion is clearly strict obedience to the letter. The last plate depicts Job after his bitter ordeal and final enlightenment. His sons and daughters about him, all playing instruments or singing in chorus, practicing what Blake regarded as the true religion of the imagination, the God within. Addressing the concluding chapter of his last great prophetic book, Jerusalem, to know the Christians, Blake wrote, "I know of no other Christianity and of no other gospel than the liberty, both of body and mind, to exercise the divine arts of the imagination, the real and eternal world, of which this vegetable universe is but a faint shadow, and in which we shall all live in our eternal or imaginative bodies, when these vegetable mortal bodies are no more. The apostles knew of no other gospel. What were all their spiritual gifts? What is the divine spirit? Is the Holy Ghost any other than an intellectual fountain? What is the harvest of the gospel in its labors? What is that talent which it is a curse to hide? Worshipped in spirit and in truth, and are not the gifts of the Spirit everything to man? O ye religious, discountenance every one among you who shall pretend to despise art and science. I call upon you in the name of Jesus. What is the life of man but art and science? Is it meat and drink? Is not the body more than raiment? What is mortality but the things relating to the body which dies? What is immortality but the things relating to the spirit which lives eternally? What is the joy of heaven but improvement in the things of the spirit? What are the pains of hell but ignorance, bodily lust, idleness, and devastation of the things of the spirit? Answer this to yourselves, and expel from among you those who pretend to despise the labors of art and science, which alone are the labors of the gospel. Thank you.